Fairy tales were originally made for adult entertainment, but eventually things got just a little bit out of hand. You wouldn't believe the lessons traditional fairy tales teach their kids. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button to never miss another video, and don't forget to give us a big thumbs up. Let's check out 10 terrible lessons fairy tales shouldn't be teaching kids. Stealing is okay. Let's talk about some of the oldest non-Disney fairy tales we all know, even though we might have forgotten them as adults. We all know the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, but many of us have forgotten just how crazy this story actually is. When he's trying to sell his cow in order to get money so that him and his mom could afford food, Jack meets an old man who says he has some magic beans. Because that's not creepy, right? We're pretty sure most of us would run as fast as possible if we heard a man telling us he had some magic beans, but not Jack. At home, when Jack planted the seeds and from it grew a beanstalk, he climbed up it and reached a house of the giants. We then learn that Jack randomly stole the treasure from their house without showing any remorse at all. Jack then says that trading the cow for some magic beans was the right thing to do because his family now has a treasure. It was supposed to be a lesson in everything falling in place eventually and taking risks, but was it really okay for Jack to steal that treasure? His mother even encouraged him to go up the beanstalk again, even though it's clear Jack was stealing the money. Breaking into a private property is fine. Goldilocks and the Three Bears raises a similar issue. The story begins with Goldilocks going for a walk in the forest, which is dangerous on its own. She then finds a house and knocks. No one answers. Most of us would let it go at this point and continue with our walk. She walks right in and helps herself to the porridge on the table. She even dares to complain that the porridge is too hot and too cold, and continues to eat the porridge that was just right. She does the same when she sees 3 chairs in the living room. Someone should have taught her that she shouldn't complain about things that aren't meant for her in the first place, especially not if she breaks into the property. We'd be pretty scared if we noticed 3 bowls of porridge on the kitchen table. Clearly, that means someone is either supposed to be home or will return home soon, especially since one of the bowls turned out to be pretty hot. That should be her first clue to get out of there as fast as possible because someone is clearly home. Violence is normal. Fairy tales are often criticized for normalizing violence as a form of intimidation. Almost everyone knows just how much violence is present in fairy tales, to the point where it's totally normal. This is specifically known for any stories made by the Grimm brothers, who seem to have wanted to create stories that were as gruesome as possible. Hansel and Gretel is probably one of the darkest stories ever, even though it's beloved by many. Not only does it talk about parents neglecting children, it also introduces a witch that wants to eat the kids. She even fattens up Hansel to make sure he'll make her as full as possible. Totally normal, right? The Bluebeard fairy tale also features a pretty extreme amount of blood for a story that's actually meant for kids. Bluebeard also goes to the extreme when the girl finds corpses of Bluebeard's ex-wives. In the original Cinderella, the stepsisters cut off parts of their own feet to fit them into a glass slipper, which definitely sends a wrong message to the kids. We'll seriously never understand how stories like that could be suitable for kids in the first place. We're pretty sure a lot of kids get nightmares when reading a couple of these and hope they didn't grow up thinking violence like that was totally normal without any consequences. Extreme punishments are expected. Fairy tales often reward modest and humble girls while punishing those that wear specific clothing or even have thoughts that aren't common. Writers like Hans Christian Andersen have no problem exposing young girls to torture and death. In The Red Shoes, the girl danced in her shoes so much she eventually danced to her death and begs to have her feet chopped off. So the lesson of the story is that if you dance too much, you won't be able to stop and will have to have your feet chopped off in return? Sounds pretty extreme for someone who likes dancing, right? The original story of Little Red Riding Hood tells that the wolf forced the Little Red Riding Hood to eat her own grandma, but not before he gets in the bed with her. These stories suggest that the world is full of terrible adults that always want the worst for their kids. The punishments are extreme and almost always result in ending the character's life or getting rid of a few limbs. This intimidation tactic could create unwanted fear of authority in adults, even though we all know most adults aren't as bad as fairy tales portray them to be. Walking alone is perfectly fine. Most kids in fairy tales seem to walk alone through some kind of a forest or a dark area that would be pretty much unsuitable for any modern children. We've all heard of horror stories of children walking through areas by themselves, and this seems to be totally okay for kids who definitely don't question the safety of the characters' decisions. Like Goldilocks, for example, who has no problem going for a walk through a forest. or Little Red Riding Hood that's way too young to walk alone to her grandma's house. In the stories, this is considered brave, but some of these characters are incredibly lucky that nothing bad ever happened to them. Well, some characters were definitely far more lucky than others. The problem is, these characters, often kids, walk alone, which is considered brave, and it's often the main catapult for an adventure that might lie ahead. We all know that if any child dared to walk alone in modern times, they definitely wouldn't run into a fairy tale adventure. Even stories like Into the Woods make walking through a forest seem like an amazing story, and that every child that walks through the woods will witness magical things happening along the way. The reality is definitely different, and every child should know how dangerous walking alone actually is. Happily ever after. One of perhaps the most twisted things fairy tales teach kids is that there's always a happily ever after. After the characters face something terrible, they meet someone, fall in love, and get their happily ever after. This teaches kids that they shouldn't be prepared for any future mishaps that might happen in their lives, because they already went through their worst one. Seems a bit unrealistic, right? We all know happily ever after doesn't really exist, and adults have to constantly face new challenges in life, and these really don't go away. Many adults have reported that happily ever after was their ultimate dream, especially after reading fairy tales with happy endings. Whether in a relationship or alone, human lives just aren't as simple as the lives of fairy tale characters. We have to teach kids that lines in fairy tales are actually just lines in fairy tales, and the reality is much more complicated. The rest of your life story depends on you, but you have to be ready for anything to happen. Of course, this brings us to our next segment that's very much in line with the happily ever after. Every fairy tale character has one thing in common, and you all know what it is. Every girl needs a Prince Charming. It seems like every girl needs to have her own Prince Charming, someone that completes her, someone that's her other half and that can finish her story. Until recently, many cartoons, especially Disney movies, followed the rule that main characters absolutely have to find their man in order to be happy. Cinderella, Ariel, Belle, Snow White, and plenty of more fairy tale princesses have all found their own prince to finish their happily ever after. But many are criticizing the stories as they're not in line with the modern times where marriage shouldn't be the end destination and the only expectancy in a woman's life. Therefore, it's extremely important for kids to be taught that happiness is not a destination, and neither is getting married and starting a family, as there are other options available, despite what society might say. With social norms being challenged, we should also adjust the traditional stories we share with kids who might expect their lives to be a totally smooth ride. Fairy tales, we really want to know where you're hiding our prince. We want answers, and we want them now. Highlighting gender stereotypes. While we're on the subject of Prince Charming, it seems like the female characters aren't really able to do anything until their prince finally arrives. Ariel gets provided with a shelter and a future life by Prince Eric. Prince Charming makes sure Cinderella has her own version of happily ever after, and Aurora practically gets saved by Prince Philip. It seems that those characters were complete messes before they met strong men that were able to help them. More than often, female characters are stereotyped as weak and often completely domestic. They get themselves in trouble through their naivety and often have very limited intelligence. On the other side, the main male characters that act as their love interest are handsome, loving, and complete gentlemen. They're strong and are able to make the female character feel secure and safe at all times. Now, we all know this gender stereotype is nowhere near the truth. Fairy tales are also criticized for their job placement of women. More than often, women are typical stay-at-home domestic workers, while men do much more interesting physical jobs. Well, times have definitely changed, and those lessons should be forgotten and adjusted to the modern times where a woman is capable of doing the same exact work as a man. We should teach kids, especially young girls, they can be whoever they want to be, regardless whether their profession comes with a gender stereotype. Good versus evil. Fairy tales are supposed to help children identify the good and the evil, and help them see the positives and negatives of both. Children are taught how to use their moral compass, but just how accurate will that compass be in the real world, where the lines between good and evil are often blurred? Good always seems to win in fairy tales, and the stories often rely on the main character that can single-handedly defeat the evil through whatever process. This is much more complicated in real life, where the evil also comes with a lot of good. For example, many evil characters come with good intentions, and many good characters, like Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, come with bad intentions without fully converting to to the other side. Fairy tales make it much more difficult for children to see why someone who's supposed to be the good guy actually did some things that were morally wrong and unfair to others. But how can someone who's supposed to be good do bad things? It's a lesson that's sometimes hard to understand, even for adults, but it's something we should definitely try to teach our kids and pay close attention to characters' actions in fairy tales. Different people aren't normal. One of the biggest lessons most kids subconsciously learn in fairy tales is that different people, especially those that have a unique look or condition they can't help themselves with, aren't normal. These are side characters that often don't have the best features, and those features get highlighted even more to make them more unappealing. Even though the ugly sisters from Cinderella definitely weren't on the good side, they're not the same as some of those other characters you see in the story. But because they're evil, they're portrayed in the most horrible way possible. The truth is, looks don't really determine whether you're normal or not, as long as you are kind and you have a beautiful soul. This lesson is definitely portrayed in Beauty and the Beast, but many fairy tales from the Grimm brothers lack the lesson that just because your features are different, it really doesn't make you evil. More than often, the main characters are able to tell someone's bad just by their look. And this can be anything from red eyes, big lips, dark clothing, and plenty of other fairy tale stereotypes we see way too many times. But these stereotypes should also live only in fairy tales, as every child should know that their particular feature or look doesn't make them any less normal than anyone else. That's it for our video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button for more videos like this one. See you next time!